Hello, everybody. Come on in. Settle down. Welcome to another presentation on the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Arehart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition, our 274th, being recorded on Thursday, October 22nd, 2020 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, we were due to have me and Dan Wilson on, so it was supposed to really be an Ask Us Anything. I haven't seen Dan join yet, and I was dealing with some other things right up until just before we started, so I haven't been able to reach out to him, but that's okay. This is going to be somewhat challenging in that, I mean, besides, it'd be nice to have Dan, and I hope he'll join in momentarily. I'll see when he does. But also, this StreamYard software that we use, the service that we use, which is cool, y'all should check it out, which streams to YouTube, it doesn't easily allow me to give any of you guys the mic. In fact, I can't even see you all here. I can't see who's here. But if you'll go ahead and ask questions in the chat, we can start that way. And if somebody has something that they prefer to either ask on voice or camera, or if they want to answer somebody else's question on voice or on camera, I think what I was hoping to have Dan check this out in advance, but I think what I'll do is I'll give you the whoever wants to do that, I'll give you the StreamYard Studio to let you in. So if any of you are commenting in YouTube, I should see it here in StreamYard. And so far, I've only seen one from Drew. So it's not going to be a lot of fun as an Ask Me Anything unless anybody asks me anything. Actually, I have some things that I would just bring up. I was prepared to possibly do that if I needed to. But Drew, since you're here and you've interacted in the past here on the Meetup and in the community, might you have anything you'd been wanting to ask about? And I decided to go ahead and do video this time. While we wait, in case anybody may say, where are you talking from? Actually, let me ask first, Drew, since I can see you, and there were a few dozen RSVPs. So again, StreamYard doesn't show me who's on right now. I'd have to go look at YouTube, and there's a lag, so I didn't want to get confused by that. But Drew, can you confirm that you hear me okay? That would be a problem if perhaps people aren't hearing me. I'm going to go ahead and get the YouTube channel up just in case there's a problem. There you go. I see a bunch of stuff coming in all of a sudden. That was really weird. It all came at once. Thank you. Now let me just see if, man, it just a boatload. Okay, cool. You're confirming you can hear me. Awesome. Great. Thank you very much. All right, great. So that stuff was just so weird. All right. So looking from the top down. Okay, so here's a question. And they do jump around. That's kind of a annoying feature for doing this. Regarding, yep, okay, so Roman Chick asks, and I can click the button and y'all can see it. So Roman says, I have a question regarding the HF updates folder in ColdFusion. There are all hotfix jars from previous updates and waste a lot of space. And he goes on to say, including unpacked folder for all of them, can I safely delete them? Or will this break CF? So that's a great question. That's one I really wish I'd put together a blog post. I know I've talked about it in some posts in the past. So the answer, in fact, let me go ahead and share my screen to demonstrate what he's talking about. Just a second. Might help somebody to see it rather than just to hear it. And I know you don't currently see that screen. Just let me get there and then I'll open the give you by you guys. I also want to make sure I haven't already done what you're asking about because there you go. I have not. All right, cool. So let me share that screen. Sorry, it's been a little slow to respond. It's first time doing this. Hope everybody's patient with us. These are challenging times. In fact, I'll tell you what, let me share that whole second screen. And I'll move this to a different screen. There you go. Perfect. All right, so you can see my Windows Explorer here. So here we are in the ColdFusion 2018 CFusion HF updates. For those who haven't paid attention to it, actually a couple things. One is that if you have multiple instances, like I created a test instance, test 1, test 2, they're siblings to CFusion. They actually have their own HF updates folder, but that often won't have much in it, or sometimes it will. It kind of depends. But let me just get back to the CFusion, because some of you won't bother with multiple instances. So you just have this CFusion HF updates folder. And as you apply updates, a new folder is created for every update you apply. These happen to be in date order. So you can see that I did ones back in September, January, June, and July. And the number here represents the update number. Now, before I answer Roman's question, let me also clarify something, because I see people do this all the time. The updates are cumulative, so you don't need to do one after the other, after the other, after the other. Hold on a second. I'm seeing some text from Dan coming in. Just a second. But Dan, if you're listening at the same time, I've just sent it to you via email. It's a lot easier for me to do that than to try to do it by text. And again, I apologize everybody for these kind of fits and starts, first time doing these things. So what I was saying is that just beware, you don't need to apply them one after another on a given day. So if I came into my machine and I didn't yet have update 10 and I was on, here comes, I hear a mic sound. So there's Dan. And here comes Dan. Yeah, there he is. All right. And can you speak? And we can confirm we hear you.
Yes, in a moment of
Awesome.
competence, I went into the wrong StreamYard link.
No problem. All right. So have you been hearing what we've been saying in the YouTube?
Oh yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so we'll get back into we'll switch gears over to anything you might want to add. But let me finish up this thought here. So so as you apply the updates, you don't need to do them one after another. I was trying to say that if you were on update, 4, like I was at this time, and you wanted to go to update 10, you could just do update 10. You don't need to do them one after another. And that contributes to there being lots of these, which goes back to Roman's question. But in my case, I just did these, when they came out, September, January, June, July. And his point is, whenever you do these updates, these folders get created for each update that you have applied. And there's a jar that's downloaded whenever you tell the CF admin interface to download an update, or if you go download it yourself and put it in this folder, there'll be a jar. And if you haven't noticed, the jars get progressively bigger. So here's back in hotfix 1, I happen to have that around still. It was only 50 meg. Then there's the 5 at 225, the 7 at 228. And it's funny, 8 went down and then 9 starts to go up again and 10 goes up again. Anyway, the point is, his question is, do I need to keep these jars around? Do I need to keep these folders around? And a side question might be, what about these properties files? Well, here's the bottom line. Once you've applied them, you could delete them. Absolutely. And I know some might say, well, Charlie, why didn't you just say that in the first place? But I want to say more than that. Yes, you can delete them, but there's a big but. In each of these folders, I'm going to look at my 10, the most recently applied one, there is an uninstall folder. And in that uninstall folder is the process, the jar called the uninstall jar for uninstalling that update. And it's got this backups folder, which has all the things that were in place when the update was applied, which the update or any of the prior updates have changed. Remember, they're cumulative. So even if I do them one after another, or if I do it at once, this folder gets to be bigger and bigger with each update because it's a copy of all the files, in my experience, that any of the updates would have updated. We might think it would only have the ones that the last one updated, but I don't think they're trying to be that tricky. So the point is, it gets bigger and bigger. So this backup, I'm just going to show you for a second. This backup folder alone is 280 meg, and that's a contributor. If people are, storing CF on a drive that's maybe a SSD and has low amount of free space, that's a concern. And then if you haven't noticed, there is a hotfix folder for the PMT, the Performance Monitoring Toolkit, and the tech notes for the update will tell you if they've updated that, but it's always there. So you should look at that. And then again, there's this uninstaller folder. So yeah, this folder in total, just for the update 10, ends up being 300 meg. And with, 4 of them there, 5 of them there, it's probably, about 1.2 gigs, something like that. Anyway.
Hey, Charlie, wow.
You want to say something?
We had a couple of requests if you could possibly zoom in the screen a little bit so people could see the text. Some folks are saying it's not legible for them. Well, is there a zoom option? I'm not sure how to do that in Windows Explorer.
Yeah, no, there wouldn't be a zoom option, but let me just increase my resolution.
Yeah, because if not, I mean, we can just kind of talk through it. I think, the main point you're making is there's a bunch of files and they take up a lot of space, but there could be a reason to keep them around if you want. Was it the uninstall functionality you were looking for?
That's the primary thing, is the uninstall. If you remove it, you're going to lose that ability to uninstall, and that might come back to bite you. So think twice about it. But let's just say, maybe the practical answer would be don't delete the most recent one, so that at least if you've just applied an update and you're going for days or weeks and something goes wrong, you could at least uninstall that most recent one. So if you do that, let's say after a week or two, you could certainly get rid of the older ones either right away or after that couple weeks, or after a couple weeks, even get rid of the latest one. So hopefully that answers.
Yep. And then can you kind of talk through the types of updates one would get? There's like more of a spot fix, more of a hot fix style. And there's also like a cumulative fix. Can you just talk the audience through that?
Just a second. Let me make this resolution and see how that looks. And let me get that back up there. Hadn't helped a whole lot, but let's see if people think it's helped some. That was 19 by 12. I didn't think I'd have to.
Yeah, it's probably the best you're going to get. And frankly, I think the text isn't really that important, although I do apologize. Exactly. It's not legible. It's more the concept here that we want to drive home.
So first of all, about the updates, and again, we're talking about the ColdFusion update mechanism that's new since CF10, so 10, 11, 2016, 2018. This update mechanism, which has that automated interface in the administrator to download and apply updates, since they did that back in 2012, there is no further distinction like there was in 9 and earlier of hotfixes, cumulative hotfixes, and security hotfixes. That used to be a nightmare in CF9 and earlier because people didn't know that there were 3 different types. Well, now there's just one type. When you use the CF admin and say, is there an update? It's going to tell you there's an update, and it may just be security updates, or it may be that it's got some hotfixes and security updates, and it will always be a cumulative hotfix. They went away from distinguishing them, so it is just always cumulative hotfix. Now, maybe where you're coming from with that question, Dan, and people would also wonder it too, perhaps, is that sometimes Adobe, in the time frame between coming out with these updates, which is about quarterly, sometimes it's 5 or 6 months, just depends on whether there's issues. Sometimes between those updates, they do come out with a, we'll say, private hotfix. It's not one that they announce. There's no list anywhere. But let's say you encounter a bug and you report it and Adobe fixes it. They may say, and here's a hotfix for you. And they may announce that on the tracker and say, here's either here's a hotfix that everybody can use, or they'll say, we have a hotfix. And if you reach out to them, they'll give it to you. Now, that could frustrate some people that they have to ask and that there isn't a list, but there isn't a list. You have to ask. Well, those jars, those hotfix jars, they would literally be a file of a name like hf-some number-jar. Now, notice these say hotfix. Sorry, I'm trying to get my mouse up here. Oh, goodness. And switching the resolution around, it's moved which one's right and left. Just a second. Come on, get up there. Where is it? Where is it? I'm just figuring I'd see my mouse eventually somewhere. Anyway, these individual hotfixes that get provided, they're different. They don't go in here. They don't get implemented by this update mechanism. I'm saying if you get from Adobe a hotfix jar that's a specific hotfix for a specific problem between updates, that hotfix jar, you would just go put directly, let me just use my mouse to get there. You would just put that directly into the CFusion lib updates folder, and you would drop that hotfix jar into here. Now, some of you may notice, again, it's too small for some of you. I appreciate that. But that says CHF 2018-00010 jar. You know, you probably haven't paid attention to it, but this CFusion lib updates is where you used to put jars for updates back in CF9. You did it manually. Well, since CF10, it's done for you, and it puts this one in here. And the point was, if you get a individual hotfix from Adobe, you would put it in here. They would tell you, put it in here, restart ColdFusion, and now that you don't take this one away. Very important. Don't take the CHF away. Your little individual hotfix is going to add to this cumulative hotfix, and they've got that taken care of. Just do it. It'll work. That's the way it's supposed to be. Now, one other little thing about this that, I help people with this stuff every week. So I'm sharing tips from my experience. I know it's beyond what the simple question was, but when you come along later and do, let's say I do update 11 when it comes out, if update 11, update 11 will remove the jar that you add. You don't need to worry about it. That used to be another problem, is that we would add these jars into this updates folder and we'd have to remember to take them out. The update mechanism will take it out. What I'm not clear on is, does it only take it out if the update that's being added incorporates it? I don't think it's that smart. I think the update mechanism removes any jar in here, and that would be a problem if the update you're adding isn't in that update. So again, I think Adobe would give you that insight to say, hey, you might need to add it back. All right. So that's the answer to your question, Dan. I haven't been able to watch the other questions coming up. Was there any follow-up to this? We can move on to other ones.
David Levin had a question about mandatory updates. Do they have to be installed first before anything?
Yeah, that's an interesting question about mandatory updates. That's an unusual term that technically was only used once in CF10. And what happened, and there's a similar thing that happened recently. I'll get to that in a second. But just to put things in context, this mandatory update back in CF10, it was like weeks after CF10 came out, and it added this new mechanism in the CF admin to download updates and apply them. They had built into that download mechanism of the CF admin a mechanism to also verify that jar that you downloaded from Adobe was really from Adobe.
Oh, I remember that, I think.
Yeah. You can argue it's overkill. I mean, you're clicking a button in the admin. Where else is it going to go? But it did do that. So you would download the jar, and unbeknownst to you in the background, and it still happens today, it'll verify the jar, checking a client certificate against a server certificate. Well, the bummer is, like, literally days after CF10 came out, the server certificate somehow got stolen, corrupted, whatever. It had to change. Well, when they changed that server certificate, that meant that whenever you downloaded jars, this was back in CF10, when you downloaded hotfixes in the CF10 mechanism, from that point forward, they would download, and at the end of the download, they would fail and then say they couldn't verify. So they came out at that time, shortly after 2012, in 2012, sort of came out. They came out with what they called the mandatory update, and you had to apply it manually, which was annoying. It was like the old ways. You had to get this jar, put it in the live updates, restart ColdFusion, and after that, then when you downloaded any updates, they would verify. And all was well from that point forward. And 11 came out, and that was no longer a problem. 2016 came out, that was no longer a problem. 2018 came out, no longer a problem. Well, then For some reason, in June of last year, June of 2019, it happened again. And if you did any updates since June of last year, but had not applied the update in June of last year, so today people are experiencing this. I'm telling you, you go download CF today and you install it, you're going to see it doesn't have all the updates applied. You're going to go to the latest one because we just said they're cumulative, right? And you're going to download the latest one. It's going to download it, and then it's going to, it doesn't verify. So here's the deal. If you read the tech notes, people don't, but
Wait a minute, tech notes?
Right. In the update interface, there's a link that says read more on every update, and that's a tech note for that update. Nobody reads it, or few people read it. Most people do not read it. And if you read it, the first thing it says is that, hey, you need to apply the June update. So in the case of CF 2018, it's update 4. And in the case of CF 2016, I'm pretty sure it's update 10. So it tells you at the top of the tech note, you need to first apply that update. And just to be clear, if you weren't following what I was saying about CF10, it's the same problem. It's that the server certificate in June of last year somehow got corrupted, changed, whatever. And CF had in it a certificate from the original installer of CF 2018, from the refreshed installer of 2018, from the original installer of 2016, the refreshed installer of 2016. They had the original certificate. And so until you apply the update from June of last year, you'll keep being told, hey, you need to, you can't verify the download. Now, the good news is that it's no longer, that's why I'm saying it's not technically a mandatory update in the same sense, in that it was a jar you had to manually download and apply, and it was called the mandatory update. It was really annoying. Instead, you just have to apply the June 2019 CF update. Once you apply that update, then you can apply any subsequent ones, no problem. So bottom line is, let's say you installed CF 2018 today, you would install update 4 and then update 10. That's it. So it's kind of annoying, but it's not as bad as it could be. You don't have to do them all. People do think they have to do them all. And then finally, just one last thing. If you don't do this update from June, you could still skip right to update 10. You just have to go get the jar yourself and manually apply it. There's a discussion in the tech notes about how there's a link to get the jar, and there's a discussion of how you can manually use the Java command from the command line and run the jar, and that will open up an installer and install that update. It won't use the admin, and therefore it won't be doing the verification. It will work. So technically one could, even today, download 2018 and apply update 10 right away. Or if you have an installer for 2016 still around, you could install CF 2016 and go right to the last update, which I think is 16. You just have to do it manually. Or get the June update, do that first. So technically it's a mandatory update, but it's not called that in the same sense. Anybody have a question or comment? Yep. And then I see somebody saying, Kevin, you could copy them from somewhere else. That was a while ago that he said that. That's the other way of saying what I'm saying. You can go to the Adobe tech note, and they have a link for the jar in the tech note. So you can get it from them manually by just downloading it. Or yes, if you have it anywhere else, you can bring it.
While we have a gap in questions, which yes, this is a good reminder for folks to have their questions. The idea is that we'll make up whatever you want to hear. Yeah. And at the CF Summit next month, I'm going to be heading up a panel about the future of ColdFusion. And I think it would be interesting if folks would type into the chat, if you were in control of the ColdFusion product and could do like some amazing new stuff with it, what would that be? And so go ahead and, think about it and type in your ideas into the chat, and we'll get to them as they come. But now we have a comment from Mike, Charlie, about guidelines to determine the value for a maximum number of cache queries in the CF admin.
Good question. And I have an answer, but I'll give you a second to reply if that's one that you've got experience with.
Well, in my mind, caching is, it all depends on what you're trying to do and what the cost is of caching it. The actual footprint of a query is almost nothing considering the amount of space that servers have these days. And so I would want to know what the application does and how you've sort of accounted for the fact that data could get stale if you cache it. If you're fine with stale data, or you have like a flush mechanism where the cost of stale data isn't a big deal, then I would set it very high.
Okay. Let me go ahead and get a CF admin up on the screen for a second.
And while you're doing that, and I'm sure you'll do your very, very best with screen resolution, if you think about the workload that's taking place when a user requests a page in your application, there's a network request from the client to your server, and that server is going to call out to some source of data. That could be a local database on your server. It could also be a remote API. And so depending on the data distance and the amount of hops necessary, plus the amount of computation time necessary to pull that data together and get it in the form that you want, there's a whole lot of cost in there. And if you serve it from cache, you're skipping all of that. You're sort of handling it right there in the application layer. There's a lot of value in caching. There's also some sharp edges. There's a famous saying that says there's really two hard problems in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. I'm sure you'll agree with the second, but the first one is also hard.
Yep, cool. And back to the original question of how you would determine what the maximum should be. And again, let's be clear, he was asking about cached queries. There's lots of other caching features in CF, but as far as cached queries, I'm working on bringing up a CF instance. It's going to be up in a moment, and I'll show you the admin. We're talking about on the caching page, down towards the bottom, there's a thing that says maximum number of cached queries. So to follow up on what Dan said, and just to back up in case people aren't familiar with it, there you go. When you do a CF query with the cached within or cached after attribute, that will cache that query. And it's important to understand that it's going to cache the results. It's, again, following on what Dan said, it's going to be whatever you asked for, how many columns, how big were those columns, and how many rows. That's going to be how big that one cached result is. And then if you haven't really thought this through, every variant of any SQL generated by that SQL statement is going to be cached. Every variant of every SQL statement generated by that CF query that says cached within or cached after is going to be cached. So you could have one template with one CF query that does caching, and it has variables like, incoming URL variables or form variables, or it's driven by another query, whatever. That one query could generate 1,000 cached queries.
Well, let's actually walk through an example, Charlie. So imagine for a minute that you're searching for a car, and you know that you're a Toyota person like I am. And so, if you want to search for cars by the make of Toyota, there's a finite list that's going to be. And so there's also a limited number of options that are available for makes. There's probably 20, 30 makes in common use in the world: Ford, Chevy, Toyota, etc. And so if you had 20 versions of this query, but this is also an oftenly requested set of data, and I believe it is common for people to search for cars based on their make, they have pretty good loyalty to it, then you're going to end up with 20, 30 queries that are very commonly used, and you're going to take a lot of costs out of your computational system. So then you think of the next permutation is you want to search by model or type. It's very rare that I don't know if I want a hatchback or a pickup truck. I probably have a pretty good idea. And so maybe what I want to do is search for make and also type. So now I want all the Toyota trucks. And now if you think about it, if there's 30 different makes and there's maybe 10 different types of vehicles, now you have 300 individual queries that could possibly be cached. But these are all at a level that they're going to be commonly used. So like the good programmer, you think, well, if 300 cache queries is good, more is actually better. And so you just keep adding in filter criteria. So then you add in years. Why not? I know what year I want. I want anything newer than 2016, cache query. Then you add in mileage. And so someone types in 100,000, and now you have a cache query of Toyota trucks with 100,000 miles from 2016. That query, and this is the most important part of my example, is likely to never be requested again during the lifespan of that cached element. Whereas all the Toyota vehicles is probably common enough that you'll get some value out of the expense of caching. A mileage would not be, because what if I type in 99999? And now I have basically what's functionally the same as 100,000, but now I have a second query that's not going to be requested again. And so really, I think the question that you're asking, it seems like it's more of a limit of what should ColdFusion be able to handle, but I would turn it back to you and say the guidelines are, what are your data usage patterns? What is the cost of assembling the data? And what queries are likely to be used at least one more time so that you get some value out of that caching?
So yes, in the sense of just roughly guessing based on your understanding of things. That's why we've backed up and helped make sure people would understand. You may be able to consider those things that Dan shared and come up with a good number. Remember, that was the original question, is how do you pick a number? I have a different way that you might be able to know better what number to pick. But before we do that, I just want to clarify one more thing. This limit was prior to, I believe, 2016, or maybe it was 11 or 10. I can't remember. But it used to be that this was a limit per the instance. So once 100 cached queries were saved, that was it for that instance. And then in one of the releases, it was changed so that it's per application, which is a surprise for some people. So this is now, in this case, by default, 100 cached queries per application. But now let's make sure people understand what Dan and I have been trying to get at. So if you just had one query that did caching, but it had variables and it did create 100 different variations of SQL statements, every different variation of that SQL statement is going to go into this cache for whatever time frame you set in the cache within and cached after, or cached after. And once that limit's reached, here's the bottom line, it starts to thrash. It's a cache. What that means is the next query that needs to go in, if it's full, it's going to take out the least recently used thing to make room for it and put in a new one. And so that becomes a problem. What happens then is that the queries never really are cached. They end up being really run, and the results try to get cached. But once it's full, inevitably along comes another request asking for
knocking them out. Yeah.
So that's called thrashing the cache. Well, so part of the question perhaps was, how do I know what's going on? How do I know how many things are in there? How do I know what the rate of caching success is? What's called the hit ratio. Well, there's not anything built into CF, the language, to help us with that. Some of you may know there have been some undocumented Java objects that ColdFusion had, the service factory, and you could Google around and find those, and that might suffice for your needs. That's cool if it does, but you can also tell CF to not allow execution of such Java objects. That's the setting here on the settings page. If you look for Java, you'll see that an administrator could disable access to internal ColdFusion Java components. So that's not saying you can't call Java objects. It's saying you can't call those undocumented Java objects like the service factory. So anyway, so back to, so how do we know how many cache queries there are? Well, first of all, I want to point out for those that run Fusion Reactor, this is a little known hidden gem. Up in the metrics, CF system metrics, metrics, CF system metrics. You may have never ever looked at this page before. It's down here at the bottom of this list. And look in here, it's got a count of cached queries. Now you might say, well, how does Fusion Reactor know that? They're calling that internal Java library, and they got authority from Adobe to do that. And so they're calling that. And actually, there may now be an admin API call that gives it to you, but I don't think so. But anyway, they worked with Adobe to call upon the admin API or those other internal libraries to be able to get things like how many cache queries are there, how many templates are in the query cache. Now notice there's a template cache hit ratio, but there's not a query cache hit ratio. And this is not a failing of Fusion Reactor, it's that Adobe doesn't provide for it. There is not a ColdFusion query cache hit ratio. So the point is, back to the original question, if you have the CF admin set to 100 cached queries and you have one application and you come in here and this is hard fixed at 100, then that's telling you you've reached that limit. And now almost certainly your hit ratio is going to be bad, because once it hits the limit, it's going to be thrashing things to get rid of the least recently used to make room for something more recently used. That's why it'd be great if Adobe would provide a query cache hit ratio. But remember what I said about multiple applications. If you have 3 applications, you might see this number 175, and you're not going to be able to tell, is that 100 fixed for one application and 50 for another and 25 for, you don't know. So unfortunately, we can't know. There's a limit to what we can find out. But I just want to stress that this has been gold for some people, because they either only have one application and they saw that this was fixed and they said, whoa, I didn't realize we'd hit that limit, in which case they come over here and they can increase this limit. Just remember, when you increase this limit, you're really increasing it for all the applications. And I do believe there is an application level app CFC, this dot query cache size thing that you could set for a particular application if you wanted to. So this is the default, and you can override it. There you go. This setting does not apply to the application. That's kind of their way of saying that you can override the application specific setting. So that's that. To answer the question of how you would set it, you have to understand what it is, how it works, how it is per application, and then get a tool that will tell you how many are in there. And I was trying to fire up the PMT, the Performance Monitoring Toolset. Let me see if it succeeded. So for those of you on CF 2018, it now provides for you this thing called the PMT, Performance Monitoring Toolset. Typically, you would install it, and should probably install it on its own machine, separate from ColdFusion, because it's got its own database, which is a Elastic Cache database. And that Elastic Cache database could be pretty big and use a lot of resources. And the PMT itself could use a lot of resources and a lot of memory. So it's probably best to put it on its own machine. But anyway, the PMT is a monitor for ColdFusion 2018 only, doesn't look at 2016. And yes, it's available in standard and enterprise. And among its many things, you just have to dig around. It has, often below the screen you're looking at, things that might be what you're looking for. So I can't remember exactly where the query, there you go. So it's on this database tab, and there's the menu, just like in CF 2018, to tell you what these things mean by clicking on the hamburger menu. So anyway, in the database tab, it goes to the top, and if you don't notice, you scroll down, this is looking at query time and query throughput. I just restarted CF. I don't have anything running, so that's why there's nothing there. But yeah, there's query cache. If there were any, they would be there, the number. And notice again, there's no query cache hit ratio. Sadly, it's just not tracked by ColdFusion. I wish they would. Maybe someday they will.
I think this setting in the administrator makes a lot of sense if you think of yourself as someone who has to build the ColdFusion administrator. But I almost feel like it's an unfortunate setting here, because it makes people think there's some number of cached queries that's, quote, the right one.
Yeah.
When in reality, like if ColdFusion doesn't really know, what your application does, all it can really do is size some kind of a queue. But, in your application, the things you want to think about are, what data doesn't grow instantly stale. You want to think about what data is expensive and what you can do about that. Sometimes it's okay if you serve people stale data. Like that would be just fine if I'm looking at a news source. If I look at an article that was updated 2 minutes ago, but I don't get the latest update, maybe that's okay if the site can hold the load. But for a credit card transaction, maybe that's not so good. Or if I'm buying tickets, or if I'm using some kind of inventory management thing, and I want to know, for example, if I can buy this video card, I don't want to see stale inventory. I want to know if I can buy it or not. And so I think, this setting in the administrator leads people to think that there's the total emphasis should be on the number of cache queries, but really there's a bit more calculus to do to know how to handle this. I just think that's going to be a bit beyond the scope of the administrator settings.
Sure. And that's where having more insight into what's cached, like it'd be awesome if we could see what queries are cached. How many rows did they bring back? What was their sequel? That'd be great. Right. Someday, maybe we'll get that.
How often was it hit? When was the last time it was hit?
Right. And the hit ratio for each query. Those would be awesome things. And to that point, I just thought of something else I wanted to make mention of, is that people that work with, some other systems are used to seeing those sort of things. And one thing they may be kind of in their mind thinking, oh, this is a problem, is this cache. I noticed the second sentence says, it's in memory. So if you didn't know it, yes, the query cache is stored by default in CF in memory in the heap. So another point to be aware of when you talk about raising this number is the bigger you raise it, the more impact there'll be on your heap. Now, back to what Dan said originally, remember, it all depends on the columns and rows and what's in the columns. That's how big the query is going to be, times how many they're going to be. But I'll just tell you, in my experience working with people, this is a crazy low number. This should not be 100. It ought to be 1,000, 10,000, because anybody that's trying to use query caching is doing it intentionally. Now, you've made some good points about why maybe they shouldn't in some cases, but the point is, if this number wasn't so crazy small, they could use more. And it's not about the size amount of memory that's used. Somebody might ask, well, why don't they have a limit for that? They just don't. They just have a limit on the number. So you have to understand what the number is. It's all apps and every query and every variation of every query, and then the SQL. So you just have to make this bigger, and you would naturally wonder, well, if I make it bigger, what will be the impact on the heap? Well, nothing tells us that. There's no query cache size. You might say, well, isn't there a way to track that? CF 2016, 11, and 10, and 9, and 8 had the CF server monitor, which you could turn on memory tracking, and that would track the query cache size. But everybody who ever tried it generally found that turning on that memory tracking killed their server. So they tended not to do it. So we've tended not to have any way to know how big the query cache is. And by the way, Fusion Reactor has something to track that as well. Right up here, it says query cache size, but it's not set. And that's because unless you turned on that feature in CF to track it, there was no tracking it. Well, anyway, the other point I want to make about this is that it doesn't have to be stored in memory. Here, a little known thing to a lot of people is that by default, yes, ColdFusion uses EH cache since CF9, and EH cache by default is configured to store its stuff in memory. There are XML entries in the ehcache.xml file where you could tweak it to store stuff on disk. But anyway, the default is that it stores it in memory. And in CF 2018, there is now another alternative called JCS, Java Caching Service, JCS. You could look into that, and it can be backed up by a database. So I'll just put that out. And then I'm not using the standard edition. So, right. So in 2018, not only can you switch to JCS, but you can now, in 2018 Enterprise, you can, these last two are only in Enterprise, you can switch to Redis or memcached. So if you wanted to, all the caching that CF does on this page, query caching, your caching, underlying cache functions and methods, that stuff could be stored instead in a Redis or a memcached that's off the server or on the server, but typically you'd put it off the server. The point being that box could have, a lot more resources and memory and whatever, and it's a NoSQL database, so it's all in memory, and that, is highly performant. And that's just a cool thing that's available in Enterprise or Developer in 2018. Redis and
a couple points here, Charlie. I'm glad you showed the different caching options, because that's important for people to know that those caches, many of those caches in that list have far more capability in analytics than ColdFusion exposes. Remember, ColdFusion is least common denominator here. So its query caching is almost a naive implementation. If you have advanced caching needs, you might look at having a cache that's separate from that and using those cache metrics for your purposes.
Exactly.
The other thought I wanted to put in there is you kind of put out some of the distributed caches. And this gets actually interesting, because if you have a situation where you have multiple application servers and each one is caching a query, it's kind of a bad thing that there's multiple copies of this cache query, but that's not really what's going to cause problems. What's going to cause problems is desynchronization. And so if you have a distributed cache, you can look at that as sort of the quote canonical trusted single source of truth. And there's this well-known pattern called write-through caching where you can cache an item, but then invalidate it when someone does a write. So imagine for a minute I'm running an e-commerce store, and in my e-commerce store, I am selling phones. There you go. Great phone, has a lot of features. That's not going to change because it's a manufactured device. So why wouldn't I cache that? But I'd want to have a capability in there that if a product manager went in there and changed something, that I would then invalidate all copies of that cache and serve the newest thing. If I have application level caching and I have a bunch of servers, that's a bit of a problem because how am I going to notify all these applications to invalidate this bit of cache? But if I use a single cache that's distributed, and cache will do that, Redis will do it, memcached will do it, you can write through cache, invalidate that entry, and then load the new one. And because all your applications are pointing to the distributed cache, they'll all receive the latest bit of information.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of query caching. It's a great feature and it's been around forever. At the same time, if you have an advanced workload, don't let this hold you back. There's other ways to do caching that provide, rich architectures to solve your problems.
Those are all excellent points. And I would just point out two things to kind of follow up on it. One is, just to be clear, in case people don't understand this, this is the default server-wide caching. To be clear, they don't say this here, but they say it in the docs and in the release notes. And if you read the CF query cache and all that stuff, the caching that I talked about here could be configured per application. So different applications could have their own cache. One could be using Redis, one could be using memcached, one could be using. So I just want to say that is possible. It's not obvious, but it's possible. And then second, to the point, it's a great point about the need to sometimes do invalidation of the caches. Rob Brooks Bilson did these awesome series of posts back in 2009, I think it was, when CF9 came out, and he talked about when CF9 added all this caching ability. And there's not been a lot of discussion since then. I think Aaron, one of the Aarons, Johnson, I can't remember, also did a series about the same time frame. There really hasn't been more. We ought to do a session on caching, because what it's going to say is that the caching functions that were added in CF and some new attributes on the caching that was already there does give us greater possibility than was traditionally available. And you can invalidate the caches with ColdFusion. And you may have known that and meant to imply that. I just want to be clear for everybody else. So first of all, there is the ability to give, I believe it's names and regions to caches. So again, I'll leave you to look into this, but you can give names and region to caches, and then you can run commands against the caches specifically. And then you can make them be dependent on things. And that there's a lot more power than many people realize. So this is a subject that just understanding the fundamentals for a lot of people is a big surprise of what's there and what's maybe not there. But then learning what's possible with additional capabilities and then adding more of what Dan said, I think we could probably, we did APIs this year, maybe next year, caching.
We can have the caching show coming up if enough people will show up. Really, all I need is one person. So if you're that one person, like, comment, subscribe, throw a few fire emojis in there, and we'll definitely do it. Speaking of doing it, Roman Shtick has a question about ColdFusion filling up DB connections with sleeping connections, and he's having a bit of a problem. Part of me wonders if this isn't those zombie processes that you see in Fusion Reactor that, you can see a thread that's been going on for multiple days. Roman, can you clarify your question just a tiny bit so we can work through addressing it? I have a feeling I know where you're going with it, but I want to make sure that, what advice you get or ideas are actually relevant.
While we wait for that, let's go back to a question from much earlier. There was only one that I saw a minute ago when I went looking back, and that's this one from Jeff McLean. And we could knock this one out pretty quickly, I think. It's a great question. Let's talk about JRE, meaning the Java runtime, environment, JVM, JDK. All this mean the same thing for the most part. Oracle wants big bucks to keep it updated. Using JRE 8 and stuff, CF10 installs. I've went to Amazon Corretto and Dev, and it works fine. Recommendations for production. So a couple key things to know about this. One is that Adobe does not formally support any open JDKs, not Corretto, not the open JDK from even Oracle. Adobe only formally supports the Oracle, JVM, JDK, JRE. That's important to know. Second, in January of 2019, Oracle did start charging to use either anything from Java 11 up or any updates to Java 8 or 11 from that point forward, from January 2019. You'd have to pay Adobe. That's what, or pay Oracle. And that's what Jeff's getting.
Charlie, I want to address something that's come up a lot, and people, you can hear it. People are maligning and they're complaining and they're moaning. But look, folks, you got to understand how this really works. Larry needs a bigger boat. You know, he just bought a Hawaiian island. You got to decorate it somehow. Nothing's free, man. Like, help poor Larry out. He's got coconut trees to buy, pina coladas to drink, boats to wax. Let the man get his money.
Well, let's offer some good news to this, because I don't want to leave this last point hanging. That's, you know, Dan's always good for the levity. Thank you for that. I've always appreciated that.
Got to look after Uncle Larry.
In January of 2019, this is very important. Everybody hear this. Adobe announced in a blog post, I think the blog post came out in February, they announced that they, Adobe, had reached an agreement with Oracle, and we, CF users, do not need to pay Oracle. So, Jeff, to be clear, we do not need to have a license for Java to use it with ColdFusion. That's really awesome, because everybody else using Java, if they want to use Java 11 or above, or if they want to use Java 8 with any updates after January 2019, anybody else has to pay Oracle for that privilege in production. We do not, using ColdFusion, we do not need to pay for that privilege. And some of you have heard or noticed, perhaps, Adobe offers the downloads for Java on their website. So I'm going to go real quick here and just say ColdFusion downloads. Now, you may notice I'm not saying Java downloads. I'm not saying Oracle downloads. I'm saying ColdFusion downloads. And this first link, it's not where you download ColdFusion, which is additionally confusing. It's where you download things related to ColdFusion. So tools and add-ons and builder extensions and crap like that. So anyway, down here at the very bottom of this list, and again, I appreciate some of you found out was too small. I'll zoom in a little bit. So on this ColdFusion downloads, the last link is additional third-party installers. That just drops you to the bottom of this page, and there you'll see Java 11, 8, 7, Java 8, 261, 251. And they only keep the most recent couple of them for Java 8 and Java 11. They do list Java 12. That's because back last year, Adobe added support for Java 12. And by the time they came out with it, Java 12 was no longer supported by Oracle. For those who haven't been paying attention, Java's gone through this thing where only Java 8 and 11 are current long-term support. LTS means long-term support. They are constantly updated by Oracle. 9 and 10 came and went. 12, 13, 14 came and went. Now they're on 15. Then there'll be 16. Then there'll be 17. And that's due to be the next long-term support. So we're going to be in this state for a while where we will be updating ColdFusion to use Java 11 in case of CF 2018 or 2016 after doing a certain update, or back in 2016, Java 8. You can't go to 11, but you can do Java 8 after a certain update from like 2014. Anyway.
See, folks, Papa Adobe is helping Uncle Larry fund his boat addiction, so you don't have to. I think that's phenomenal. Round of applause. We did have an update from Roman. He's basically saying that if he kills connections in MySQL Workbench, ColdFusion will start working again. I've actually seen this behavior happen when there's a network partition of some type or some interruption in between ColdFusion and the database, and these threads just kind of hang out there, kind of waiting, and in somewhat of a suspended mode. And even Fusion Reactor can't kill them. The only way to fix them is to bounce the machine. I think that's because the thread happens outside of the context of control for ColdFusion. But you know, Charlie, I have a feeling that this particular issue has popped up at least once or twice in your troubleshooting work. So maybe you should add some color here and help Roman out.
Well, one thing I'd want to make sure I understood, I just showed his 3 comments for those who were watching. Here's the first one. He said of CF filling up our DB connections with sleeping connections and he's tried to play with settings in the admin, and CF would hang up, and then he would go into MySQL Workbench and kill the connections, and it would start working again. Well, there's a few things that I'd want to make sure we're clear on. One is that in the CF administrator in data sources, so I'm clicking on it. Oh, there you go. And yeah, here's a MySQL. Not that it matters because these settings are in all the data sources, but under advanced settings for any data source in CF, there is this limit connections and a restrict connections too. Now, I don't think he's using that, but he may be trying to use it to solve the problem. But let's just be clear. If you don't use this limit, then CF will create a connection for every request that tries to run, and it'll create a pool of connections, and it'll try to keep that, from going too crazy. And it could create a lot of connections, and this is per data source. So some people have 100 data sources, and if things could conceivably lead to thousands of connections between CF and whatever database, MySQL or otherwise, just first of all, be aware that some database engines have limits on how many connections are allowed from a licensing perspective. So you might want to use this limit connections to say, hey, this data source should only have, pick a number, 50 connections. Now, what that means is that 50 current requests doing queries against that database in that data source. And beyond that, then they would get held up on the CF side. But he's saying, no, they weren't held up on the CF side. They were piling up on the MySQL side. And I just want to clarify first, it could be that if you did limit this on all your data sources, you should seemingly be able to keep it from growing wild on the MySQL side. Should. Maybe there's a
Now, you did mention the word held up, which made me also think of Uncle Larry, because Uncle Larry also owns MySQL. And so if there is a way for them to limit you by license, they've probably done it so that you'll pay them more money.
Well, that's
so
right.
Really,
that's what I'm saying.
Fix everything is buy Uncle Larry a boat and you'll be all set.
There might be a limit. Some versions of some database servers do by license limit how many connections you can make. And that's one of the reasons this feature's here, to say, okay, I'll try to limit. But it's challenging because it's per data source. You've got to keep track of how many you have. It's a question of how many are running at a current time. So that's
really the question, isn't it? I mean, he says that they're sleeping connections, and you would think there's some kind of connection pooling going on.
That's
that
what
would at least reuse connections. But what I'm getting from Roman, and I kind of wish we could put him, kind of make him audible here, or her. I'm not sure. We've never met. Why is this a problem? Are these connections that are busy and can't be reused in a pool? Is it that they're sleeping and somehow that causes a problem? It'd be nice to get a tiny bit more detail here.
Well, but he's saying I tried to limit the connection to 200 and we got 200 in the workbench, and then I made it 300 and it filled those up. So let's just be clear. So the limit is working. When you made it 200, it wasn't more than 200. When you made it 300, it rose to 300. Your question, I guess, Roman, is why, if it's 300, did it create 300 connections? Well, I don't think that out of the box, CF just goes and creates all those connections immediately. I'm just going to say, I don't believe it does that. Maybe it does. And if it does, well, they're going to be in there. And you said they're sleeping. They should therefore not be doing anything. They shouldn't be a problem. Maybe if you're got an issue where you're not allowed to have that many, if you lowered it to a more reasonable number like 50, maybe there wouldn't be a problem. But the question is, I know you're saying there seemed to be a problem. If you're saying CF requests that were trying to run, that wanted to do a query, tried to create a connection and couldn't because MySQL said I'm out of connections, well, that would definitely be a problem, because now the ones that are trying to run can't run because the limit's been reached. And lowering it here wouldn't seem to be the solution. It was very interesting that you said killing them in MySQL made them go away. That's an important thing for people to pay attention to, because sometimes the solution to problems is on the database side. There are long-running queries. If you killed them, things in CF would suddenly work again. But this is getting a little bit beyond what we could probably reasonably cover in the remaining few minutes. So this may be a good one for us to pick up on another session. And by the way, next week, we don't currently have anybody scheduled. We do the next 2 weeks. So we could do another AMA next week. He said, when I removed this setting, CF filled all the connections. allowed. So, okay. So it does seem that he's experiencing that as soon as CF comes up, somehow it creates all these connections. I really don't believe that's the way it's supposed to be. One thing I'll throw out is it might depend on what version of MySQL you're using. It might depend on what MySQL jar you put into ColdFusion, its version. And it might depend on connection string values or JDBC URL values that you put in. So usually people will need to get the JDBC driver and put it in and create another JDBC driver. Just make sure you don't maybe have some unusual arguments in the connection string or the JDBC URL that could be contributing to that. But I'll just say it's not one that I've heard of as a common enough one that I'm readily able to say, here's your answer. So good one, Rommel.
Yeah, and I don't want to turn this into a sales pitch, but Charlie's too modest to mention that primarily all day long he helps poor performing applications or applications with issues on a short-term per hourly kind of basis. And this is the kind of problem where there's not really an easy answer here. There's some confluence of events that'll have to be dug into to get to the root cause of it. The nice thing about working with Charlie is he's probably either already knows this or can get to the bottom of it very quickly. And secondarily, it's, you can engage him on short periods of time, an hour, a couple hours here and there. And, he can airdrop right into your system. And so if this is truly a problem and you can't find resolution, I would humbly suggest taking a shot with Charlie. I've actually used him on some stuff before that had me stymied, and vouch for him.
Thank you, Dan. That was very kind. And yeah, not only, a 15-minute minimum, and I have a satisfaction guarantee. So if we spent time together and you felt that it was useless, then you won't pay for that time. So yeah, happy to help with any kind of problem anybody has related to CF. So thank you for that. And that does sound like an interesting one that I'd love to get to the bottom of. And once we solve it, we could blog it too, so other people learn from it. That's what I try to do.
Yeah, my big experience with these thread issues is when there's some kind of disconnection between the two servers, and ColdFusion has an open thread that doesn't get hung up correctly, and it just sits there waiting on a reply.
And I found with MySQL that happens with the timeouts not being in sync. So remember right here, there's a how long should the connection remain alive? Once it's been established, it can live for up to 20 minutes. And every 7 minutes, CF wakes up and tries to find stale connections and remove them. Well, I've found, for some reason, there's a certain MySQL setting that can sometimes be out of sync such that CF thinks it's to be removed, but MySQL doesn't, or vice versa. I've seen that be a problem.
Somewhere deep in that configuration file is the wealth of all knowledge. One character here or there can make your day and keep you from having to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and figure this out.
Dragons.
I didn't really get any ideas from the audience about future, what ColdFusion should do in the future. This is just a reminder. We are running up on our time here. And so if there was something you wanted to put in there, the only ideas that are dumb are mine. So feel free to put whatever you like. Or hit me up on Twitter later, because like I say, I'd like to know what the community thinks as well.
Absolutely. And if not here, we'll only be here for another few minutes. If you guys don't get to offer answers here, you can either reach out to Dan or me individually. I'm at Carehart. Let me put that in there. And Dan, do you want to use the one? Which Twitter handle would you use?
Yeah, I just used @Dan_Wilson.
And you could add comments also, because this is going to be, a YouTube recording that as soon as we're done, the recording's posted immediately. And you could add comments there after the fact, and I'll get notified. Dan wouldn't, because it's my stream, but he could keep an eye on it if you'd like. And I'll try to remind him if there's something sent to him. Yeah, we'd love your all's feedback, for anything, topics you want to hear more about, speakers that you're interested in seeing. We'd love your help in encouraging speakers that you want to see. Because, when we ask them, they might think, well, you think it'd be interesting, but maybe nobody else does. So I think a lot of people really want to hear encouragement from the audience. And so, and also we can't think of every speaker. There's so many. It does get frustrating reaching out to a lot of people and either getting no reply or they're just for some reason not interested. But if you reach out to them, that might be the motivation they need.
Brian asked a question about when the ColdFusion Summit is. Firstly, let me say that it is November 17 through 19, and it's going to be basically from 8-ish in the morning Eastern until probably 1 p.m. Eastern. So we really worked hard to figure out the most convenient time span, considering this is now going to be a global event. Quick fun. How many registrations do you think we have right now? The first answer that's semi-close gets a prize. 10 free hours of Charlie consulting. And no one said anything. I'll give you another, I don't know, 5 seconds to type anything. 4, 3, 2, 1. The answer is there's already 5,000 registrations.
Goodness.
Hey, look, they were only off by an order of magnitude. So anyone that tells you ColdFusion is not a vibrant platform can clearly go read some news, because literally 5,000 registrations and there's still 3 weeks left to go. That's insanity. I'm really excited to be a part of it. There's an outstanding lineup of speakers. If you Google ColdFusion Summit, you'll get to the website for it and you can see what sessions we have ready to go. And for your viewing pleasure, there's some more that are coming, which are super cool. So I advise you to tune in, and there's going to be cases where you're not sure, should you go to A or B? They will be recorded, so you don't have to really, quote, miss anything. But, please show up to something, because the way we look at it is who showed up on deal day. That's how we know if this was successful or not. So I'm proud to notice, I'm proud to mention and be the bearer of the news that we're, cresting 5,000 registrations and only going up from here. So,
and thanks for your work on that, committee there, Dan.
Yeah, it's a highly paid position. I receive endless gratitude. Endless gratitude.
Also, thanks for the comments from the people that have said a couple things. And let me just throw out a couple others. We'll just go another minute or two. Somebody asked a good question here. Jeff asked another question. Saying make. I guess he's saying to Adobe, please make a stripped down version, and we only pay for what we use. And you're right, with the next release, which is either going to be CF 2020 or 2021 by my estimation, and I had a blog post explaining that. But anyway, yes, it is designed in the new release to be much smaller out of the box, with modules that you could add, kind of like with NPM, you could add modules. It's not as elaborated, of course, as with the big, worldwide library of things, but the CF functionality, there's about 15, I think, different modules that you can choose whether you want to be there or not. And the thinking, people looking at it would think, well, that's an opportunity for Adobe to maybe offer licensing that would be different, so that if you just needed the core engine, maybe that could be priced differently than if you add modules. But they have not announced that. They haven't even hinted at it, and they never talk about that stuff prior to a new release. So we'll see. Who knows?
Yeah, it sounds like a crazy engineering challenge for sure. But, at the end of the day, if you did have something like that, what you'd find in terms of our caching is, certain spots of your application are hotter than others. And if you could offload that or scale that one section without having to scale the whole thing, that'd be awesome. We'll see if it's something they can do. I can't imagine what would have to go into something like that.
And also, you can currently already use Docker with ColdFusion 2016 and 2018, and the Docker image for the new release is much smaller, and people will be able to use that for means of scaling, and we'll see what the licensing will be about that in the future. But hey, there was another question here from Bruce. Has there been a Visual Studio Code app extension and tuning session? And I just want to clarify, I thought you were asking, has there been a ColdFusion based extension for Visual Studio Code? Yes, there has been. There's a couple from the community. And if you haven't heard, Adobe has said they're going to do one as well. So literally CF Builder, which is currently built on Eclipse, is going to instead in the future be built on VS Code. And they've said it's going to be either available as an extension, if you want to put it on one you've already otherwise customized, or it'll be available as a white labeled ColdFusion Builder, which under the covers is VS Code, which you could then extend to your heart.
Charlie, if you'd have told me 5 years ago that there'd be some editor that's written in JavaScript that would take over the planet and it would be free and be coming from Microsoft, I would have thought there was, many bags of crack that you smoked. But somehow 5 years later, here we are. All those things are true. And it's frankly a great product.
And the world is running to it. And so Adobe understands it and is working towards it. And I'm sure that's going to lead to more questions, but we're running out of time. As far as a tuning session, I don't know if you meant tuning of VS Code, that if what you're saying is, have we had anybody do a talk on using VS Code in general and with CF specifically? No, actually, we haven't. And that would be an awesome talk. If any of you want to give it, anybody's welcome to do it. I will say that if you don't listen to the Modernize or Die podcast from Ortus Solutions, it's every week at Tuesday, and it's a podcast, so you can listen anytime. Every week, they have a segment towards the end of the VS Code tip, trick, and something of the week. Sorry, extension, I think, of the week. So they highlight either cool extensions or tips or tricks. And so they do. I would recommend, if you're not watching, listening to that, you can watch it live on YouTube each Tuesday at noon Central. So check that out.
Yeah, Giancarlo Gomez, good friend of mine. Hey, buddy, hope things are going well in Florida. Wrote that he thinks they were basing their conference numbers on what they would see in Vegas. I know. I was winding you guys up just so I could have the big reveal. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, but I thought it was awesome that y'all were off by a factor of 10.
Although
ColdFusion.
Okay, so Brian, just real quick, we'll try to wrap up. Brian says how to modernize your application with APIs. Sounds like an interesting session.
I've heard of these APIs, some newfangled thing. I'll have to figure out what that's all about.
We've been doing those. I don't know if you're referring to one that had that name. I don't remember, but there will be a couple more and perhaps still more beyond that. So we've had a push in recent weeks and months on APIs with ColdFusion. So yeah, it'd be cool. And if anybody wants to do something that wasn't covered, again, you're absolutely welcome to offer it. We're not going to have time to get into all these. Maybe we'll save these for next time. So, what's your opinion of Adobe versus Lucy? That could be a whole show in and of itself. Looking for a session to point out the must-have extensions for a CF developer. Yep, that'd be a cool session. And I'll just say, you might want to throw that question out to the guys at the Modernize or Die podcast, because they might see that as a neat challenge to say, this week, instead of showing a tip, we're going to highlight a few of what we think are the best ones for people to start out with.
Or we could try dragging him over here. I'll ping Gavin and just see what he thinks. I'm sure they wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Beverly.
We're all buddies, right?
Now here, Beverly from Michigan said, we're waiting for Samuel from CF. Now this is interesting. One is, there is actually Giancarlo Gomez is on here. He did a one login open source integration, if you want to use the one login service, and that's one. There's others, but if you haven't heard, Adobe in the next release is providing SAML support with CF acting as either an IDP or an SP. So that's coming in the next release of CF. And then Bruce asked, and this is the last comment, and we'll make this be the one we'll wrap up with, a command box session. So, yep, that would be awesome. I do believe we had Brad on about 3 years ago. It'd be a good time to have him on again. I apologize if it was more recent. I'm just not remembering. But, I'm always open to that. And if anybody else wants to do one, Brad's happy to do them. But if somebody else wanted to give their take, sometimes, when people look at it from their perspective, they present things in a different way. So absolutely, Bruce, if you'd like to do one, you know how they say, you ask and you can volunteer.
And then speaking of that, I know most often we've had this format where it's one person, one slide deck for 1 hour. We have some new options these days where you could do like a show and tell, where maybe for 20 minutes you're showing off command box, and then for 20 minutes we're chatting and taking questions. That feels like a lot less pressure to perform. And so if you're interested in something that follows a looser format than the usual conference style session, hit Charlie up or hit me up. We'd love to kind of walk through what could happen and do some interesting things here.
Yeah, we're very flexible on that, and want to give people what they want. And, not everybody's going to like everything. Some people want the hour. Some people are going to only want these. Somebody's going to only want, 2 or 3 sessions within the hour. We're just going to do different things for different people, and folks can watch it and enjoy what they want to and skip what they don't. We just want to help.
Ding. And with that, thank you, Charlie, for putting this together and for sharing all your stuff here. It's been exciting.
And for you, thanks for coming along and contributing the many ways you did and do. And thanks very much for your recent contributions. Dan's been helping a lot out in recent months, finding a lot of the speakers we've had. And I'm really glad it helps to have somebody helping out. And I appreciate that, Dan. Thank you very much.
More hands in the water, my friend.
Yeah, man. And you make us smile. And that's so important.
I have few talents. When I figure one out, I'll let you know. Thanks, guys.
All right, y'all. Until the next time. Thanks, everybody, for the kind comments. Talk to y'all later.